A couple things before I get started. I have to make my usual sort of pleas and representations, because I do work for the Department of Justice, but I am not here in my official capacity. I am not speaking on behalf of the Department of Justice, which will probably become clear once I start talking. But in order to keep my job, I'm putting that on the record. To the extent that there are any Sophian reporters here, I'd prefer you quote somebody else instead of me, if at all possible, because the lower I stay on the radar screen, the more I get to do events like this. And I was really grateful that Sophie this morning started dropping the F-bombs, because then I don't feel that I have to censor myself, because as my family, I'm pretty late, right, thank you, way to step up. My brother is here in the audience, and he can tell you my family is completely horrified by the way my language has disintegrated in the past 10 years, but when you work with law enforcement at all times, that's generally the first thing to go, that and my sanity. So I apologize in advance, particularly since this is being recorded, for that, and I'm going to try to stay on good behavior. Also referencing Sophie this morning, while Sophie said, you know, she could leave here and die happy, this is truthfully one of my worst nightmares, because as proud as I am of Smith and as proud as I am of my job and of the work I do, I work for the man. Like, I work for the society and a part of society that continues to victimize women. And although my work, for the most part, really tries not to do that, it is part and parcel of what I do. And so you are a very hard audience for me to appear in front of. It's rare that I am in some ways ashamed of my job, and I'm not. I'm proud of the work I do, and I believe in it, and I have just like blood, sweat, and tears over it. But it's an imperfect system. And Lisa and I were talking last night about the distinctions, whether you try to fix something from within or from without. And my choice has been to fix something from within. And I can't fix it. I can only do the best that I can do and hope that I make changes in the areas I can make changes. But there have been some compromises and some sacrifices along the way. And I do feel I've not sacrificed my belief system at all, ever in my job. I have certainly accepted behaviors that if you had told me 10 or 15 years ago, I would have accepted from people, particularly law enforcement. You know, when I was at Smith, if you would have told me, I would have accepted some things that have been said and done, I would tell you you're crazy. And now I recognize sometimes it's a means to an end, and I need to use whatever resources I have to get justice for my victims to the extent that I can. So I don't regret any of that, and I don't lose sleep over that, but I do feel that addressing these issues in the real world is different sometimes than addressing them in the sanctity of a classroom. And I'm grateful that I was able to do that at Smith, and I think it prepared me for doing it in the real world. But I also think it's a real struggle to do it in the real world. And there are a lot of compromises and decisions that you have to make if you are going to work within the system. And so I sit here today listening particularly to this morning's panelists, and I'm sitting here thinking, you know, one of the things I need to say to you all is I violate women's autonomy. Like, if I do that to do my job. And I don't know how else to do my job. And I don't think there's a way within the system right now to do my job without doing that. I have spent, up until the last couple of years, the majority of my career, or the last really year and a half, prosecuting crimes against women and children. Mostly, I had started initially specializing in domestic violence offenses, and I then moved and did only child abuse offenses for a period of time. Then I was doing child exploitation, child pornography, and human trafficking work. And in all of those situations, I was forcing, on occasion, women to do things they didn't want to do. That really raises the bigger question when we're talking about violence against women and autonomy, particularly from the government standpoint, is who is the victim in my case and who is it my job to protect? And at the end of the day, as a prosecutor, my client isn't the victim. My client is the government, and my client is society. And I cannot tell you the number of times I was faced with a victim who did not want to testify. And I forced her to testify with a subpoena, usually. And that was the only way to ensure that the abuser was criminally prosecuted, and in most instances was actually taken off the street. And that's a much easier decision for me to make when there were kids involved, because I could at least say to myself, I'm doing this to protect the children. But again, it's a completely paternalistic thing to say, and I recognize that, and I don't have the answers to this, but I think it's an important thing to talk about, because it is something that goes on every day, and I don't disagree with the fact that it re-victimizes some of the women. As I said, I don't have a solution, but it's an imperfect system, and it's the one that I'm working within now. And it also raises sort of these questions about women's autonomy and the right to not have government intrusion. And at what point, where are those boundaries drawn? Because in so many of these instances, we would see cases where these women had been victimized again and again and again, and they had refused to testify again and again and again. And that would then generally be the point where we would not only issue a subpoena, but we would arrest victims who refused to come to court. They would be picked up on a warrant, and they would be brought into court from, we call it from the back, from the cell block, which is the same place their abusers were coming from. And it's a hard decision, and it was not one we did in every case, and there was a lot of deliberations that would go on, at least in my cases, before doing that. But when the alternative was the case gets dismissed and the cycle of violence continues, and in some instances there are children, and you worry that either they're growing up watching this or they're going to be the next target of the abuser, then in terms of, for me at least, how much sleep I was losing, I lost less sleep with the thought that I was putting a woman through testifying than with the thought that I wasn't going to do my job and she was next going to get killed, or that some child was going to get injured. And so, it was really hard this morning as I was thinking about this and last night to sort of, I feel like I'm at an AA meeting, like, my name is Kate Connelly and I went to Smith College and I violate women's autonomy. Like, it's a hard position to be in. And it doesn't only come up in the violence against the domestic violence cases. We see it also time and again in the human trafficking cases when we're talking about juveniles. What we often see is the human trafficking cases that I worked on were predominantly sex trafficking cases, and they're often pimp-driven sex trafficking cases, and they're domestic victims. And most of our victims tend to be what society would consider the throwaways. And I say that I do not consider them as such, but that's sort of how they're viewed. They've run away from home. There's nobody looking for them. There's not a safe home for them to go back to. And they don't fit into the foster care system generally because they need so many different services. And we don't have housing. There's very little housing across the country for trafficked youth. And to the extent that there is, it's far from home. There's some great programs in New York and in California, not a lot in the Midwest. We are just getting something up and running in DC. And so you have these kids that we need to have in a safe environment, but I also need to know is going to be available to testify. And again, we'd try to put these kids into such environments, and they would rabbit. They would disappear, and sometimes they'd be on the street again. And again, we'd issue a material witness warrant, and there was an instance, not in the case of mine, but a colleague, where we had a juvenile who was locked up in a juvenile detention facility for about 6 months, pending trial of her pimp, because it was the only way they could guarantee her presence at trial, and also they were keeping her in a relatively safe environment compared to what she had been in. But talk about re-victimizing. I mean, this kid who has been through so much and who doesn't really fit in anywhere is now being re-victimized by the system that's supposed to be protecting her. And by putting the pimp away, there's not a doubt in my mind that other kids were saved. There's no way anyone can tell me otherwise, because these pimps, they don't stop unless somebody stops them. They're making a lot of money off of these kids. They crave the violence. They crave the control. And these aren't the kind of people who generally, see the light, see God, come to Jesus, and decide to make changes in their lives. But it is a system, again, where we are really have to, at this instance, re-victimize these kids. And that's terrible, and it's not the way that it should be. And there has been movement in the last 5 years or so on setting up more shelters for trafficked youth, and some of them are locked facilities, but it's certainly, the shelter for youth facilities are certainly better than the juvenile detention facilities. But again, you're taking away somebody's liberty, and it's somebody in these instances who has not done anything wrong. And it's just another form of violence against women and against children that we are trying to change and to stop, but we don't have the tools in our toolbox right now to do that in a way that guarantees their rights. And so it does re-victimize them because it's an imperfect system. And I don't have solutions to that, but I also feel like this is the crowd that needs to hear this, because you are the ones who are going to be coming up in the system now, where we do have more programs for these kids and we do have more systems in place, but more work needs to be done. And I felt about 5 years ago, I think human trafficking over the past 5 years, it's where domestic violence was maybe 15 years ago in terms of the recognition and the acknowledgement and the work that's being done on it, and the laws and the people that are engaged in the conversations. And so I think it has now, we've got that base sort of developed of work and of intervention, but it's sort of your turn to really run with that, and I hope that you will. I think that there are government jobs where you really can wear the white hat and feel like you are doing the work that you set out to do, but also you're working for a much larger organization and it's a bureaucracy, and I don't have the luxury. Like, I'm very jealous listening to this morning's panelists, and then we spoke this week and listening to my co-panelists. I think the grass is always greener, but there's a part of me that thinks, like, wow, how great that they're at a different level and can speak and be activists in a way that when you work for the government, you can't necessarily. But I also think it's really important to have people working from the inside of the government, because otherwise, I mean, you have seen what happens with, I'm a career person, so I don't come and go with the administrations. I'm like one of the worker bees who will probably be there forever. But you've seen what happens, I think, in the past couple of months and certainly in the past few years when we have people in the government, and particularly at those high levels, making decisions, making determinations about our bodies and our resources and things that have very large impact on us when they don't actually have the background and the experience that you all have. So my hope is that someday I'm going to see you guys really taking this the next step and making it a better system in a way that we don't victimize women again and again in the system that we have now. So.